Welcome to the New Jersey Black Issues Annual Convention. And we really appreciate all of you joining us for this very important conversation in the state of New Jersey. Our topic around education today has to do with the segregation of schools in the state of New Jersey. And we have a panel of experts who have been engaged in this subject matter for quite a long time. So I can assure you that you're going to be well informed with some background as well as some instructions as to where we go from here. I'd like to start by introducing our panelists for the afternoon. We have Miss Olivia Caldwell, who is the president of the Pleasantville NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and she's also a classroom teacher with the Atlantic City Board of Education. And we will allow each of the panelists to make some opening remarks so that they can add anything to their bio that might be left out. We also have Reverend Willie Francois, who is the pastor and a community activist and a Morehouse graduate who has been very engaged in making sure that segregation in the state of New Jersey is brought to the front and that solutions can be discussed and formulated so that we can wrestle this monster to the ground. We have Mr. Paul Scully, who has been he's working with One Nation and is very dedicated and committed to working with community-based groups, statewide coalitions to address various issues of segregation and discrimination throughout the country, but most certainly in the state of New Jersey. And we also we'll give them each an opportunity to introduce themselves and what organization they are affiliated with, starting with Ms. Caldwell and how you got invited to this conversation about segregation in the state of New Jersey. Ms. Caldwell, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Harris, for the introduction. I think you've given them information. The only thing I'd like to add is our branch of NAACP is mainland Pleasantville. We have all of Atlantic County except for Mitzvah and Atlantic City. How I was brought into this panel had to do with our branch of NAACP here in Atlantic County, taking initiative along with Building One America when the issue of separation from the Pleasantville School District, Absecon, was brought to our attention. Absecon is a neighboring town that has a send receive agreement with Pleasantville. Pleasantville is a predominantly Black school district, whereas Absecon is a predominantly white school district. And when it came up that Absecon wanted to secede, that's when we got involved, because this was not the first time, but it was the time that looks like it was garnering the most success. So that's why I was brought in.
Reverend Francois, why would a Baptist minister who's committed to saving souls get involved in a conversation about segregated schools in Pleasantville, New Jersey?
Well, thank you, Brother Harris, for the question and for moderating today, and to all who helped make this conference flow and work. You know, that's a really good question with a simple answer. Seemingly, it's always been Baptist pastors, Black Baptist pastors, who have agitated the status quo and have put pressure on the nation, on the state, on the city to live up to its highest ideals, to appeal to a different type of conscience as we think about who we are as Americans, and we think about who we are as human beings. And so I stand in a long tradition of Black faith folk who serve as first responders for democracy. When democracy is failing, and that's what happens, that's what segregation does. It fails democracy. It compromises democracy. And so when democracy is failing, Black people of faith have shown up and have done the work to transform to transform the conditions, the structures that are really damning and condemning so many lives. one Black pastor in particular, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was also a graduate of Morehouse College, my alma mater. He says that any religion that claims to want to save souls, but is not interested in addressing those conditions, those economic structures, those social conditions that condemn those souls, is dry as dust religion. And so I was brought into this work partly by the organizing of Paul Scully, who we'll hear from in a moment. But although Paul is one who helped raise my consciousness on this issue, to do this kind of work, to fight segregation, to name segregation as a form of structural state-sponsored sin and violence, has a long history for Black people of faith, particularly Black Baptists.
Thank you very much. We're looking forward to your perspective as we get deeper into this conversation. Paul, you could be anywhere in the country doing the work that you do. Why are you in New Jersey talking about segregated schools? I mean, we're in New Jersey, we're up north, I mean, we're not in Alabama, Mississippi, or Georgia. Don't we have integrated schools? I mean, we had the 1954 Supreme Court decision that said separate is inherently unequal. So why are we having this conversation in 2021 in a northern state, New Jersey? Paul, tell us a little bit about yourself and how do you come to this conversation?
All right. Well, I'll try to answer that question while telling a little bit more about myself. Since you asked why New Jersey, I could be anywhere. I've been around the country a bit, mostly in the Midwest, Chicago, Indiana, place like that. But I think, as you know, Mr. Harris, I'm from New Jersey. I'm from actually Montclair, where I was raised. But now I live in South Jersey. So it may be a northern state, but I'm in the southern part of it, which to some degree mirrors our country and some of our difference between North and South. And as much as we like to talk about South Jersey as being the South and having some of those characteristics that we tend to think of when we think of the southern part of the United States and the former Confederacy, it's actually North Jersey that's the most segregated part of our state. And I think, as you know, which might be surprising to many, many other people outside this small group, that I think Pastor Francois pointed this out at the conference we had on Friday, that we are one of the most segregated states. While we're the most diverse state, I think we may be the most diverse state or one of the most diverse states, and we actually reflect the demographics of the country almost perfectly. I think we come in second as far as reflecting the demographics overall, so we can celebrate our wonderful diversity. But with that diversity, we have a tremendous amount of municipal and school district fragmentation that is very much racialized, both class and race. So we are one of the most segregated states in the entire country. I believe we are more segregated, other than Texas, where Pastor Francois hails from. We are more segregated than any of the states of the former Confederacy, which may be shocking to some people, but anybody from North Jersey that goes from Irvington, East Orange to Milburn can see clearly in front of their face that we are a deeply segregated state by class and race. And the schools are even more intensely segregated than municipalities.
Yes, and I'm so happy you put that into context. And just so the participants know, the New Jersey Association of Black Educators, of which I'm the president, and we've been a part of the New Jersey Black Issues Convention for a while. And I also served 8 years as the president of the New Jersey State Conference of the NAACP. So I had the opportunity of going from Cape May to Bergen County to see what was happening as far as civil rights. And what's really significant about this conversation is that when you look at population density, your larger cities are in the northern part of the state, but very segregated. You have a concentration of both race and class in all of our large cities, And when we get to the southern part of the state, we start with Camden, south of Trenton. Camden is the largest city in South Jersey. But when you start looking at Black populations and head south, you get to Camden, then you get to Willingboro, and then we get to Pleasantville and Atlantic City. Those are the largest populations of Black folks in the southern part of the state. So, Ms. Caldwell, the 1954 Supreme Court decision, which is the pride of the NAACP, those non-white Supreme Court justices concluded that separate is inherently unequal. So I suspect that when the notion of the pullout of Absecon from Pleasantville, what did that mean in terms of racial integration of the two school districts? Could you just give us a little bit of background about that, and then we'll go more deeply into what strategies we've talked about to try to fix and analyze what that proposal, why that proposal came up and why it's coming up now. So tell us a little bit about Pleasantville, because it is, I believe, the largest Blackest community in South Jersey, south of Camden. So tell us about Pleasantville and then talk about Absecon for us.
So the issue has to do with how integration is what is the most healthy thing for our students as well as for communities. Segregation, we know by statistics and all the experts, it destroys opportunity for our young people. Young people that go through K-8, K-12 schools that are completely segregated with just Black and brown people. These are the people, these are our students that will have the highest dropout rate. It is important for students to be able to be in a situation that mirrors how diverse New Jersey is. As Mr. Scully said earlier, New Jersey is one of the most diverse areas, but there are some maps, and I don't know if we'll be able to share our screen and be able to show any of that. But when you look at the diversity of a community and compare it to the diversity of their schools, then it is more likely for those students to be able to achieve more and do better. Schools that have 90 to 100% free and reduced lunch, those schools are linked with lower test scores. How can students that are in those areas, they do not even have opportunities because so many of their parents, they may have not graduated school, have not gone on to college. What is their motivation? What is their guide to even help them to think that that's a possibility? So what happens with those students? They give up. They give up. They think that they can't do it. They don't have parents that necessarily at home even know how to help them, know how to push them. They can't even see which way to go. So then you have we as teachers, because I teach in one of these districts, then we as teacher end up trying to do it all. We try not only to be their teacher, we have to be someone that nurtures them. We have to be someone that inspires them. We have to be someone that gives them direction. And that is totally unfair, not only to the students, to the teachers. That should not be. When you have an integrated school, then your students are able to begin to see what are the possibilities. When our students can't see where to go and what the possibilities are, they give up.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Talk to us about Absecon. Why would anyone propose taking their kids out of Pleasantville, which, by the way, I believe has an African-American mayor, and the majority of the people on the Board of Education, I believe, are African-Americans, and the superintendent is African-American. So why would Absecon be concerned about taking their kids out of that school system?
So there are a lot of reasons. So,
and Paul, you may want to weigh in on this.
I have a tickle in my throat, so I may have to ask one of my panelists to help me.
Let's go to Reverend Francois. Why do you think that there was this proposal to take the Black kids out of the white kids out of?
I mean, race is the reason why they just don't want.
Did you
What?
say that four-letter word?
Yeah,
Race?
it's race. I mean, and particularly the way race and class are so commingled together in states like ours, is that here you have this predominantly white town, and it's a white town, not of the most wealthy white folk, I might add. These are white folk who are just getting by. These are white folk who, work hard, just as hard as the Black folk and brown folk who live in Pleasantville. But there is something in this country about certain communities of white people whose lives, whose futures, whose communities have been tethered to Black folk. And a lot of those white folk don't understand why they can't be like the other white folk, the richer white folk, the more independent white folk, the more affluent white folk. And so this is a part of this ongoing narrative in our state of how working class Black people, working class white people, middle class white people, and Black folk actually do have a shared lot. Our lots really live and die together, but we have not been able to really build that kind of multiracial coalition to address the fact that our lives will thrive together, they will die together. But this is about race. There's so much about the Pleasantville school districts, Pleasantville itself, that has been chronically divested from, that has been chronically abandoned by white people, but also by middle class Black people as well. And so we have to talk about the issues that exist in Pleasantville, why, and they will give you a host of reasons of why the schools are not functioning at a high level, why there's not significant amounts of opportunity there. But the reason why Pleasantville is bereft of opportunity and bereft of resources is because of flight. It is because of the ways that we normalize leaving Black and brown people behind, the way we normalize leaving poor folk behind. And so APSECN wants to get out of this relationship with Pleasantville, which it has done in so many ways, in so many unofficial ways over the last 40 or 50 years. And the problem with this is the idea, for me, the problem is, I agree as well that parents have a right to send their children to whatever school they want. I agree with that. As somebody who also agrees in one's individual liberty, of course, you can send your kids to the school that you want to send your child to. But I think this raises a greater question for me, and the greater question that it raises for me, at least, is how can the state of New Jersey, allow a school district that has been practicing de facto segregation now practice de jure segregation? That we know that so many of the APSECN families have opted to go to private school, have made arrangements to get into the...
Slow your roll there. You're using big terms. Now, what is this de jure thing?
Is
that a dessert?
It's not tasty at all.
The name is not,
it's not, so because so many families in Pleasantville and in APSECN have found ways to send their children to private schools, to the most white school districts like Mainland in our area. They found ways to get their kids even to in relationships with places like Ocean City, that we know that segregation has been a practice, individual practice of several white families. And that has happened. But for the state to normalize and to affirm segregation as a rule, to say that it's okay for APSECN to completely pull out and divest from this school district, shifts from de facto, which is, it just kind of happens on its own. It's kind of happened because individual practice, to de jure, which is state sponsored. It becomes the law. And what would happen if, and it's still possible at this point, for APSECN to pull out? It has not been ruled on, as far as I know. Paul may know more than I know. But right now, APSECN has been practicing segregation on an individual level, on a person by person level. But if the state affirms and approves the removal of APSECN from Pleasantville, severing that agreement, honoring that secession, that will be state-sponsored segregation. That will become the law of the land. De jure segregation, that is the law of the land. de facto segregation, we're just doing it on an individual basis. And so my issue with this is not simply where parents send their children to school. My issue is the fact that we have a Democratic administration. Allegedly, we have a civil rights champion that is in the governor's mansion. And for his administration to affirm segregation as a state is against our Constitution, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, but it is also a betrayal of the very people who put him in office. And state-sponsored segregation needs to be called what it is. It's sin.
Very good. Just so that folks, two things I want to say. I realize that New Jersey Black Issues is a statewide organization, so there are people at the convention who come from other parts of the state. But I want to remind you, as we're talking about the conditions and circumstances in Pleasantville, think about if it relates to your community, because this segregation, state-allowed segregation, is not just in Pleasantville, it's all over the state. And by the way, there is a lawsuit that is presently active, sponsored by the NAACP at the state level and the Latino Action Network, that challenges the state of New Jersey, because New Jersey is one of the only states in the country that's where the Constitution, the state Constitution, says the state has the responsibility for providing a thorough and efficient, racially integrated public school system. And so the question is, are we compliant? And so far, the governor, attorney general, has argued that we should not hold them responsible because it's not their fault, so to speak. But we'll get into that, because Pleasantville, and by the way, Pleasantville, New Jersey is in Atlantic County, as Ms. Caldwell said. It is the only public school system in Atlantic County that is an Abbott school district, meaning that it was among the 30 poorest school districts in the state. And the courts ruled years ago that because of the low tax ratables in Pleasantville, the state had a responsibility to provide additional resources, meaning money, so that Pleasantville could become equivalent to all of the other wealthier school districts in the state. And I don't think anybody would argue that. We are a long way from that. Paul, tell us what you've been doing and why, what this looks like in terms of when you put the numbers together, because I know you have access to the numbers, and you mentioned with the census that just came out, the impact of the thought of having all of the Black folks or minority folks concentrated in the urban centers is a myth. So talk to us about that and why that's relevant to this conversation.
Okay. I thought it was interesting. I mean, Pastor Francois' answer to what the reason was, right? What the motivation of part of ABSECAN, and it almost sounded like he was slightly sympathetic for the folks in ABSECAN. We do somewhat understand where they're coming from, and like he said, it's both Pastor Francois and Olivia said it's a majority white district, but it's a relatively diverse district, like a lot of suburban districts today have relative levels of diversity. Some are extremely white and wealthy, but more and more municipalities, school districts look more like ABSECAN, where, and even more so, some of the neighboring towns like Galway Township, Egg Harbor Township are interestingly more reflective, almost mirror the demographics of the state and their regions. So that creates an opportunity for not only building multiracial coalitions to advance the interests, to advance fighting evil systems and immoral systems like segregation, but when you get them to look at it, right, you get them to look at themselves and look in a mirror, and you see that they actually are becoming those de facto integrated places. I wouldn't call them integrated, but they become de facto diverse, and that they actually begin to have a stake in trying to create a more stable, diverse, even integrated community and an integrated school district, if only for the reason that they want to stem increasing white flight out of their communities. And like Pastor Francois said, white flight is actually middle-class flight sometimes, African-American middle class and working class flight. So you got a lot of places now in the middle and we saw this when we worked on the Fair Housing Act about 10 years ago, more and more places that don't see themselves either on the very beneficial end of segregation, like the Milburns and the Mount Laurels and the Haddonfields and places like that, or the Cranberries and West Windsors, but the places a little bit more in the middle, the Ewings, the Lawrencevilles, the Galway Townships, today it's the, well, Montclair, but also the Bloomfields, the Bellevilles, the West Oranges today are places. And actually, when we look at the demographics, just talking to Olivia about this, that the majority of African Americans do not live in what we consider to be. I watched the debate last night where both candidates kept referring to these Black communities as if those are the only places Black people lived. And, you know, I think there's a lot of people who still think that way. And it's one of the reasons they run into problems with elections too. But it's just the African American diaspora within New Jersey is not even. There's still increasing, segregation happens in suburbs the way it's happened in cities, but it's happening on a broader pattern, across broader metropolitan regions. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, but let's come to this pattern that we've gotten a lot of research on, this thing called white flight.
Yeah.
I remember going to Atlantic City years ago, and it didn't occur to me that it was a Black city then. And then I remember, wanting to go to a supermarket. There was no full-scale supermarket in all of Atlantic City. I had to go to Absecon, and I go, "Whoa, this is a really nice community. All these Black folks and white folks shopping together." But this notion of white flight, I think we got to get into the heads of both Blacks and whites that when Black folks move into a community, it doesn't necessarily mean that the quality of everything goes down the tube. And I think that's what we've seen. Places like Montclair, people are still leaving Montclair, but it's socioeconomic, it's not race, but it has an impact on race. So talk to me about how do we get these folks to realize that if Olivia Caldwell moves next to you, that your neighborhood is not going to have a housing project like the ones in Camden, and she's not going to be barbecuing chicken and having watermelon parties every weekend.
What the hell's wrong with that?
Not for Olivia, but for somebody else, it may reckon that something else is coming. Willingboro, for example, the way Willingboro developed was because the realtors told the folks that Black folks are moving in, your property is going to go down, your school system is going to go down, and all of those things happen. But most of the people in Willingboro are overwhelmingly middle-class people. Well, they're middle class. So a lot of these people who are moving into these more segregated, towns that were not as racially integrated, they're not receiving poor people. They're receiving more of the middle class that can afford to move out of the central city. Isn't that true?
Well,
we have to talk about that. Go ahead, Paul.
The whites that moved out of Willingboro were of a lower economic status than the Blacks that moved in.
Yes.
Right.
Correct.
But that that probably was the case in Pleasantville and many of the other sort of inner ring older suburbs that changed back in the 70s and 80s. But then that changes because then there's racial steering, then there's Section 8, then you have another level of flight. So then you end up having poverty, and the worst fears and assumptions and stereotypes begin to become self-fulfilling prophecies because of abandonment. But I also think this is a good opportunity to get in. If you don't mind, I think it's a good opportunity. I think it's consistent with your question to get into the structures that we're talking about, because what I think Pastor Francois was describing that Absecon finds itself in is sort of this vortex of a structure of racial segregation that they feel left behind in.
Yes.
And most white communities have been able to benefit by being severed from Black, brown, and poor districts. There are a handful of kind of left behind white communities that for a number of reasons, they have these send-receive relationships. They have these old unified school districts or high school districts that are outside of, you might say, the infrastructure in New Jersey of racial segregation that is not de jure, but is de facto, is not de facto, but de jure, right? And that de jure segregation is based on having multiple municipalities and multiple school districts with separate tax bases, and the inability to move from one to the other, that's then reinforced by residential segregation and racial steering that builds and builds and builds on itself. And, I think one of the best answers to the question for what the motivation is for them wanting to get out in Absecon that does not in any way contradict the answer that Pastor Francois gave when one of the residents at a school board meeting in Absecon said, this will increase our property values more than anything else that's happened here in the last 30 years. Now, that doesn't mean it's not about race. That means it is about race, but it means, and this resident doesn't understand this, obviously, but it's a structure that actually makes housing values, property taxes, school outcomes, and all comes of other outcomes determinative by where you live, and the racial segregation by class, race, and there's a lot of brown people, Latinos that live in these communities, as well as African Americans now, especially places like Pleasantville, that they become determinative. So white communities like Absecon want to separate themselves, but our approach has been to say, look, this is a flashpoint. Keeping Absecon together with Pleasantville, we don't see that as the answer. We understand the problems that segregation has created, the dysfunction that is created, the poverty that is created, that Absecon just wants to get away from. But like Pastor Francois says, they helped create it, but they didn't help create it by themselves. It was a whole state that helped create it. And more importantly, they're continuing to bolster it and propagate it. And just make one more point, and I think it would be good for us to get into this a little bit. This is a part of a pattern across the state. Absecon Pleasantville is not the only flashpoint. Mercantville just pulled out of Pennsauken. Maywood pulled out of Hackensack. They're still trying to pull North Haledon out of Haledon. There are about a dozen of these across the state, and there's one law firm and a group of lawyers and experts that are doing this in every single place. So when you ask me why I'm interested in this issue as a community organizer, we hear a lot about systemic racism and structural racism, and those are all nice words, but we need to actually look at those structures in the face and look at the people who are actually perpetrating them, and in some cases profiting off of them, and making them happen. And we have to attack and challenge those structures, those real structures, and dismantle them. These are not just vestiges of Jim Crow or slavery. They're with us right now, and they're actually being enacted and supported by the state, including under this administration. So Pastor Chris was getting on. I just wanted to bring that back up.
Let's talk about that for a second. We are having this convention within 40 days of an election for the governor and all of the legislators, all of them.
Yep.
So it would seem to me that at the next debate, that one of the questions that both candidates should be asked is, what do you intend to do to help solve this problem of racial segregation in the state of New Jersey? Obviously, the Republican candidate can say what he feels. The governor has to say what he's done. Reverend Francois, if these candidates thought that there was a whole bunch of preachers of all races and ethnicities and religions that had this as a concern, don't you think they might pay attention to it and talk about some solutions?
Well, what we know for sure is that the governor has sort of demonstrated a type of political unwillingness. I think that's the softest way as I can say it. Cowardice is probably how I would say it if I wasn't on camera, but I said it anyway. Wow. A kind of political cowardice on the issue of school segregation. I know for sure that the governor was invited to our statewide conference our statewide summit conference last week on school segregation. I'm not sure if the Republican contender was invited. I can't remember that exactly, but I know the governor was invited, and the governor declined several times with mounting pressure. I believe that we have put and will continue to put on him and his campaign and his administration if he does win in a month or so. So yes, this is the kind of issue that I think should get dynamic reaction from anyone who's running for public office, anyone who's running for any power over there in Trenton, because this is a significant stain on the soul of this state. You said it. You walked it down for us, Brother Harris. Is that we have one of the strongest constitutions when it comes to setting an affirmative obligation for integration in our schools. No other state can boast that. And it is interesting to me that the Democratic Party that runs our state is okay with being the party of segregation. I really thought we were no longer in 1940. I really thought this was no longer. I thought this was no longer the antebellum period when the Democrats were on the side of upholding white power. It's amazing to me that in blue New Jersey that you have Democrats who are okay with being the party of segregation. And remember, when we're talking about segregation, we're not simply talking about diversity and inclusion, but that's important too. But we're talking about access to opportunity. We're talking about access for building power, building wealth. And what we know is that because we are reaping the rotten fruit of the indifference and inaction of Democrats like the ones we have in office now, is that 75% of the school districts in this state are medium to low opportunity school districts, right? Can you imagine that? In a state that we send people to Harvard, we send people to Yale, we are number one in school education, in public education.
Reverend Francois, Ms. Caldwell, isn't it true that the governor sat on the national board of directors of the national NAACP? Isn't it true that when he was campaigning that he never allowed people to miss the fact that he had sat on the national board of the NAACP? So do you think that maybe the governor either didn't get the news, maybe he was like, Juneteenth, maybe he didn't get the message? Shouldn't
Well,
he be on the right side of wanting to have racially integrated schools in the state of New Jersey if he's carrying the banner of the organization that was responsible for arguing and winning before the Supreme Court in 1954? What do you think is missing here?
so we do know that the governor was on the National Board of Directors. I cannot speak to why he wants to be silent on this and not to participate in it, other than perhaps Reverend Francois has put his finger on it. But what we do know is that this issue of segregation is tied into poverty, is tied into housing choices. It is all linked together. And we have to make sure that we are able to push our legislators. They have to look at all of it. When you look at the opportunity districts, and Paul, we did get a message that all of us can share if you want to put up that information. If you want to look at opportunity areas, those are the areas that are the most integrated. Those are the areas, Black, white, brown, whoever, Asian, those are the areas where the students go on to be the most successful. This whole issue of poverty, the whole issue of poor education, it's all tied in together. Housing, it's all braided together like a three-stranded rope, and it is strangling us. So you have to deal with all of it. You can't ignore what's happening. And we have to make sure that we do more. We have to make sure that when our legislators are ready to put something out to the public, we have to be involved in it. People who know this type of information, who not only have their ear to the ground, we have been paying attention to the research so that legislators won't put something out there in a vacuum. Like we know that Sweeney is in the process right now of talking about how we should be able to have different types of school districts. Okay, but if that's the case, You cannot do that in a vacuum just with legislators. You have to do it where you have multi-levels of stakeholders involved, because it is a myriad of different things that impact what's happening with segregation.
Well, Ms. Cole,
One of the
on
speakers, if I can just say this, one of the speakers yesterday, Myron Orfield, said that segregation is a modern system of slavery.
Ooh, heavy.
You know, and that was very powerful. When I heard him say that, I was like, wow, because it is controlling. And then we had another speaker to talk about segregation and the way that it's being done. It is like a monopoly, okay, for the whites that want to keep everything, where they are restricting the opportunity to a certain group and class of people. It's creating a monopoly. So these are very powerful metaphors that we really need to pay attention to. You know, again, we thought this fight was over, and it is no way near from being over. So let me stop, because I know my partners want
we have about 10 minutes left. So let's go to solutions. What solutions were presented at the conference on Friday at Mercer County College? Let's talk about solutions. How do we propose to get to a solution?
Well, let me say this: that Myron Orfield is one of my favorite people, one of my favorite thinkers, and he's right. I mean, segregation is slavery. It's slavery without the guilt. We get to have slavery without feeling guilty about having slavery here. But you know, our coalition, we are 100% behind this pretty much 8-prong approach to a legislative remedy to this. I want to say this: we are clear, because our Constitution is so strong, that the people are going to win this one, right? The people are going to win this one because the Constitution is too clear that segregation is unconstitutional in this state, in our schools, for any reason. But here is how we frame a legislative remedy. Let me ask my colleague, am I okay to lead off on this one, or did one of you all want to take it?
Go ahead.
I know sometimes my patriarchy may get in the way too. So one, this has to be based on the opportunity analysis, right? We're talking about a desegregation plan must be based on racial inclusion, but also factors around social and economic opportunity, right? This is about inclusion, it's about opportunity, and it is about power building. We say this, all districts have to be involved. Everybody has to be involved in this. And when we say that, we're talking about shutting off all doors to flight, closing the back door for white flight. We know that small scale projects will not work. That it takes the entire region to get this work done. And it has to be implemented up and down the state. The entire state has to be a part of this. Secondly, we talk about we have to set achievable, fair goals for inclusion and integration. Is that this is what our state looks like. Our state is diverse. That means every school district, every classroom must be diverse. This requires requires widespread efforts, because we want our classrooms, our districts, to reflect the diversity of the state. Let's just look here of some few areas. Look at the Trenton area. What you see here in the Trenton area is that diversity already exists in these larger metropolitan areas. People want to tell us it's not possible to integrate schools. Well, why is it already happening in places around Trenton, but not in Trenton? Look at Atlantic County. Right? It's happening in Atlantic County, but it's not happening in Atlantic City and Pleasantville. Look at Egg Harbor Township and look at Greater Egg Harbor. It is almost mirroring the diversity of our state. It's possible. Let's look at Camden County, right? You see it's not happening in Camden itself, but look around Camden. That there are 4 or 5 places around, 3 places around Camden, Cherry Hill, Black Horse Pike. You see these places that are already mirroring the kind of diversity that exists in our state, right? Newark, and we know Newark is one of the most intensely segregated places in the nation, but it's happening in the Newark metropolitan area. You get to Woodbridge, Morris Township, Mount Clair, that there are levels of diversity that are already being achieved in our state. So we can already say it's happening. So don't tell us it's not possible when we have suburban places that have figured it out, which I'll say in a moment, need to be rewarded for figuring it out, getting us out of this, right? So goals must be based on opportunity as well as race. We talk about opportunity in terms of social and economic factors. You know, you can think of those things as income, wealth, jobs, tax base, right? So in this next map, you'll see some green and you'll see some blue. These are the places where opportunity is real. You heard me say earlier that 75% of the school districts, we have 600 plus, 610, is that right? We have 600 plus school districts in our state, and 75 of them are in medium to minimum opportunity. Most of that related to class, most of that related to race. Only 25% of our schools are in high or maximum opportunity places. But again, it tells us it's possible in this state to spread some of that opportunity around. So here is how we think about approach. It's a combined approach. We'll use diversity and opportunity analysis in order to get this done. There are so many laws that are already on the books that we need to strengthen. There are laws already in the books that we need to strengthen. Let me run through some of these with these successive slides. Next one, Paul. Mm-hmm. One, the school funding formula. We know that it's good. It is celebrated all over the country, but guess what? It can do more. State aid should prioritize and advantage diverse districts. Funding should support strategies that foster inclusion within districts, schools, and classrooms. There's a high poverty districts should not be penalized. It's not their fault that they're high poverty school districts. Our flight is the fault. Our disinvestment is the fault. Policy is the fault. Funding should support high opportunity districts, those 25% we just talked about, as they diversify. You shouldn't just get extra funding because you're high opportunity. You need to share some of that power, share some of that opportunity. So funding should chase diversification. The interdistrict public school choice, right? This program is not really about promoting integration, but it can and it should be. Make it mandatory for high opportunity districts that fall short of regional integration goals. Let's make it mandatory for them. That spaces in these districts should be prioritized from students from the most segregated and high poverty districts. We have county school systems, county schools, and also magnet schools, right? These two, they don't naturally lean into our pro-integration goals, but they can. We should require these school districts, we should require regional goals for economic and racial balance. There should be legislation that creates and supports pro-integration regional magnet schools in our urban areas, right? We can put one in Pleasantville. I think that'd be a great idea if we put one in Pleasantville. And there must be legislation that requires charters to meet regional integration goals as well, which we know largely they don't. We have a school consolidation law that just went into effect, and that law primarily helps us save money. Somebody needs to tell the Senate president saving money is cool, but there is no constitutional obligation for that. We need a bill, a school consolidation bill, and we already have amendments for this, that prohibit withdrawal, separation, and dissolution, sort of what FCECN is trying to do with Pleasantville right now. It needs to be prohibited, and we must require an affirmative obligation to create racially and socially economic integrated districts. That's what a school reform bill should do. And I know what you're going to say. Everybody's going to say, oh, this is about residency. This is about residential areas. This is about municipalities. This is about people wanting to live where they want to live. Well, guess what? We should include affordable housing in our goals for school and classroom integration. Well, let's strengthen the Fair Housing Act to better promote inclusive districts. Affluent districts who think that they're too far flung, they need to integrate, should be required to deepen their affordable housing obligation. There needs to be a more affordable housing in these places. And guess what? How do we get this done? Obviously, we're not going to get it done just because I'm marching every week. We're not going to get it done just because Miss Olivia knows the governor and puts pressure on her. We actually need a Department of Education that has serious civil rights capacity. We need legislation that strengthens the capacity of that department to enforce what we are saying we need today, to enforce school integration. And we also need them to do work that is conducted by opportunity analyses and not just arbitrarily the way we see secessions and all sorts of things happening right now.
All right. Those are the caveats, and then there's a summary. Sorry, this thing's on a timer. That's why I keep going ahead.
So yeah, so do we need to go through the caveats now, or are we? Because I don't know if we have much time.
Yeah, we still have about 10 minutes left.
Okay, we got 10 minutes.
We got an extension.
So here's some caveats. One, we're going to avoid short-term quick fixes, especially those that settle for costly expenditures instead of true inclusion. We're not going to blame the victim. These racially isolated, highly concentrated poverty zones did not create themselves, right? Segregation comes from bad policy. It comes from flight. And so we have to be clear that we should not blame the victim. And we have to also be clear that not all suburban and urban districts are the same, that New Jersey is diverse. The way we are spread out is diverse. And so there's no cookie cutter approach to this. As you saw, our multi-pronged approach to this. And, an article of faith for us is do no harm. Even the best intentions have some unintended and harmful consequences. County consolidation will not capture a diverse enough area to stop white flight. Simply removing district boundaries would accelerate white flight and deepen segregation in many places. Magnet and vocational schools should not create new layers of exclusivity and exclusion. And magnets, as well as charters, must meet meaningful goals for reflecting economic and racial diversity mix of their regions.
All right. And then
so we the folks who attend our convention come from multiple organizations and all parts of the state. Sure. So are we talking about deputizing everybody who's at this convention, who's sharing this workshop, to go back and do what? What is it that we want individuals and organizations to do as a result of the solutions that you've just presented?
Paul is my Bayard Rustin. I'm the Dr. King of this movement. JK. Paul is our Bayard Rustin. And Paul has some very specific action items that he can share now that we shared at our conference, just to bring another voice in, that we shared at our conference that people can do day one. One, I'm just going to say this. You need to say amen to this legislative agenda that we just laid out, because it's doable and it is the answer. So say yes and amen to this agenda. Let's put the pressure on our electeds with this agenda. But Paul and President Caldwell, you all can give us our marching orders.
Does that make President Caldwell Rosa Parks?
Fannie Lou Hamer.
There are some parallels.
As long as we make sure that she's sitting in the front of the bus.
Yeah.
And that makes Pleasantville simply Montgomery.
Yes, it does.
There was a spark for the whole state and eventually the whole country. So we think we have a huge opportunity here. And I think it's really important. I'm glad you did it this way because, we took on the Pleasantville case, not because we want to just spend the next 20 years fighting Absecon like they've been fighting this thing for 30 years, but to use it to raise the broader issue, or even just to stop these secessions around the state, but to use it to advance, basically to say not just the people in Pleasantville, but the people in Absecon who have a stake in this. There needs to be a broader solution to this, one that's actually much more meaningful, much more transformative, and much more lasting that involves, like, I think the first slide, that involves everyone, that
Well,
closes
well,
up other doors to what flow.
let me ask the question. You're saying that these districts, there are other districts that have been allowed to separate.
Yep.
Do not they need the approval of the Commissioner of Education to
And they got
do
it.
them?
And they got it.
And they got it. They would not have succeeded in the courts, but Mercerville did it under Hespy. Hespy now works for Gagliardi. He's now part of the team doing the former commissioner who signed off on Mercerville out of Absecon is now working on the team trying to pull Absecon out of Pleasantville. But unfortunately, Lamont Repollet, he signed off Haywood out of Hackensack.
The context of the reason why I asked the question the way I did these separations occur over the last 4 years?
The one Mercerville was 2016, I believe. Hackensack just happened last year.
Right.
Okay, so here's the context that I need people attending the New Jersey Black Issues Convention to understand. We're talking about things that are happening not in the best interest of all folks, but particularly African Americans who are concentrated in these segregated schools. These things are happening under a Democratic leadership.
Yep.
With what one but two African American commissioners of education.
Yep.
Lamont Repollet served the first few years of Murphy's administration. Angelica Allen McLean is now the Commissioner of Education. So it seems to me we need to be targeting some very specific recommendations and concerns through all of our big organizations to the governor and to the Commissioner of Education. And by the way, the vice chair of the New Jersey Black Issues Convention is Senator Ronald Rice. The new chair of the Black Legislative Caucus is Shavonna Sumter, a very courageous, vocal part of the leadership in the Democratic State House. So we should be connecting all of these things so that people take a very strong look at who's in charge and what can be done now.
And we're so grateful that Assemblywoman Sumter was with us on Friday, and she has been a big supporter of what we have laid out. Her pastor is a part of this coalition, and so we know that we have her support. But even to Senator Rice, who we have significant respect for, we know that the Joint Committee on Public Schools has the power, the standing, the gravitas to run up and down the state holding hearings on school segregation, and we know that they can do it, and we believe they will do it. We've got commitments from the Legislative Black Caucus that they want to help us get the testimony and the narratives of people who are suffering under the condemnation of segregation in this state. And so, we would love for Senator Rice, with all of his power, to help us lay this bare, to reveal this to the nation and the state, and to help us get towards this remedy, even if it's just starting with these hearings up and down the state, which we know the Joint Committee on Public Schools can do for us.
And Ron Rice is
brings us back to Ms. Caldwell. Ms. Caldwell, the NAACP, the last I checked, had about 30 branches throughout the state, going from Cape May County to Bergen County. In fact, the branch of the year voted at our state convention last week was Bergen County branch of NAACP. And by the way, the legislator of the year was Verlina Reynolds Jackson, who's from the Mercer County district. So when we start talking about getting other people to understand what this is all about, it seems to me we're going to have some very significant conversations with people who don't look like most of the people in the NAACP. We've got to walk out into these white neighborhoods that surround all of our communities and see if we can get these folks to the table, right? Now, I think about the Salvation for Social Justice, okay, which is a group of ministers. We need Reverend Boyer to really call a meeting of those racially integrated religious groups and have a full-blown conversation about their role and responsibility to help us push this agenda. Wouldn't you agree with that, Reverend Francois? That this is, we've got people in the Social Salvation for Social Justice is a member organization of New Jersey Black Issues Convention.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And
But-
Reverend Boyer is a great friend of mine, and you know, I would love for him to help us get that kind of, you know, to track into that audience as well. But if I can, you know, we do have a powerful advocate in the Senate who is working with us by the name, a brother by the name of Joe Cryan, Senator Joe Cryan, white brother. Has full-throatedly endorsed our work and is ready to carry this to the rest of his caucus because he understands that this is really life or death for our democracy and our economy.
So as we wrap up, do we have a timetable for moving some of these things forward?
Hey, Mr. Harris, James, could I just suggest on that to be a little more specific? And maybe we should, when we listed that, because what Pastor Francois listed, as he said, this is a legislative agenda. And we've already begun talking to legislators about transforming that into some legislation. But maybe we ought to put on the very top of that, do no harm, is do not allow these secessions to go through, with the Absecon Pleasantville case being the most recent. You know, we lost Maywood, the Maywood case, Hackensack, Merchantville, Pennsauken. But the one right now, I mean, if the current education commissioner allows that to go through, that's a very bad sign for support and cooperation from this governor. So one, you got the current acting commissioner of education who still hasn't been confirmed. Right. So the commissioner, the governor, the senators, the legislature, the senators that actually oversee that are going to confirm her have a role to play in that. And then beyond that, like Pastor Francois mentioned, the Senate, the legislators, we have the Joint Committee on Public School, which Mila J.C. and Ron Rice co-chair, and we think they could play a very instrumental role in driving this agenda in a legislative package. And then you have the two committees headed by Senator Ruiz and Assemblywoman Lampett of the education on both sides of the legislature, the Assembly and the Senate. So I think those are the main targets moving forward on an agenda that is both a legislative agenda, but on the Absecon Pleasantville case and any other efforts to secede, those should be stopped. There should be a commitment from the governor to stop any further secessions in this state. How can we move forward with if we're allowing segregation?
What we would want all of the people who are attending the New Jersey Black Issues to do is to send a letter to the governor and to the Commissioner of Education saying cease and desist any policies that would further segregate the schools, okay? And so these mergers should be stopped. And I think every organization has a letterhead that they can send, and the United Black Agenda, this should be part of their initiative moving forward. I want to thank all of you because this has been a very, very important discussion. Obviously, it is the beginning of a discussion, but this is the New Jersey Black Issues Convention, which is made up of coalition organizations throughout the state of New Jersey. In fact, the New Jersey Black Issue Convention really is the Black Leadership Roundtable for the state of New Jersey that was started by Donald Tucker over 30 years ago, coming out of the National Convention. And by the way, the New Jersey Black Issues Convention is one of the most enduring Black Leadership Roundtable organizations that has endured and prospered over the time. So we want to invite organizations that are not members to join, but more importantly, the folks who are attending our convention. This should not be entertainment. This should be a call to action, and we would like to see some actions taking place on your behalf. Do not assume that everybody else is going to move the agenda. When we work together, we get things done. When we work in isolation, people separate us, divide us, and bad things happen. So I want to thank all of our panelists who've done an outstanding job. Special appreciation to Miss Olivia Caldwell, a superior educator and also a member of the executive committee of the New Jersey State Conference and the president of Pleasantville NAACP. Reverend Francois, your name is getting around as a person with passion, commitment, and energy. And it's nice to see younger people having the passion. And I hope you're bringing some of your peers with you. And Paul Scully, For those of us who've been in the trenches and have had this conversation, thank you very much for loaning your expertise, passion, and commitment to the ongoing fight for justice, equality, diversity, and inclusion. But more importantly than all of this other language that's emerging, we're looking for equity, aren't we? That's what we're really talking about. We're talking about equity. So I want to thank everybody for attending and contributing to this, and we look forward to the follow-up.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.